we really don't take it for granted that you've agreed to be with us this morning and explain these things. So being a professor and a political scientist, we want you to keep it simple for abantu abangathanda ukubala njengathi, so that we understand the basics. Morning, Prof, and over to you. If you're talking, your mic is muted.
Yeah, we seem to be struggling to get out of the professor, but
yeah, he is there. I think he just needs to unmute his mic. Then
yes, my apologies. You know, the screensaver or something equivalent to it on a phone can be a nuisance because after a given number of seconds, it just locks your phone, and you see that you want to get in there, but you must put a PIN number and so forth. My apologies.
At least we now know that you are security conscious. Good morning, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you, Mr. Ndebele. I will not refer to the regular moderators by their surnames because they like referring to each other by their first names. So I will say good morning to Brighton and Nonhlanhla, and good morning to everyone else. And thank you to CITE for this opportunity to participate in this timely discussion because obviously of the election, which I heard you saying is 7 days away. I suppose that is true in terms of polling, but in terms of those who are campaigning the candidates in their political parties, those who have parties, it's 6 days because they will not be campaigning on Tuesday next week. The election campaign will end for them on Monday. And I suppose this is one of the reasons why there's quite some interest, some spirited interest in this issue of the voters' roll. Now, I think because we are, yes, interested in the state of the voters' roll and its implications today, but because we did not just drop from heaven today, we have evolved as a country, as a society, to understand where the voters' roll is today. It makes sense that we retrace the steps we've taken to get where we are. In recent narratives, I think going back to 2021, or at least over the last 3 years, the dominant narrative on the voters' roll in Zimbabwe has been that an election is a voters' roll. This is the view that is developed, and I've associated myself with this view and even really tried to push it hard in public discourse, debates, discussions, including on social media, especially on Twitter. But when I was preparing for this discussion and reflecting on the implication of this discussion, as I reviewed the evolution of the voters' roll in Zimbabwe, I realized that the cliche that an election is a voters' roll, while understandable, is in fact an exaggeration. And when all is told, an exaggeration which turns out to be untrue, wrong, false. because an election is far more important than a voter's roll. An election cannot be a voter's roll. An election is the materialization of political rights. And in the case of our country, this is very important because the most critical political right is the right to vote. This is the right which fueled our liberation struggle. And it is the right which continues to fuel various struggles for democracy, not only in our country, but in our neighborhood as a region, the SADC region, and arguably across the continent. To the extent that people talk about political independence, it only becomes meaningful to the person, the individual person, when we unpack the political rights of the person. More often than not in our part of the world, independence has been seen as an attribute or a feature of the state, an independent country, an independent state. But that doesn't mean much, if anything, to an individual. The independence of an individual is the enjoyment, that is to say, enjoyment of the right to vote. Broadly speaking, the enjoyment of political rights, the awareness of political rights. But there's no political right greater than the right to vote. That's why the battle cry for the independence struggles was one man, one vote, better stated as one person, one vote. So, at the very minimum, an election is the expression of the right to vote. And in that sense, a voter's roll is not an election, but an administrative instrument for giving effect to the right to vote. This really is not a theory. If it is a theory, it's a theory that follows experience that we have gone through as a country. This view that an election is the expression of the right to vote, and that a voter's roll is not an election, but an administrative instrument for giving meaning to an election or for giving effect to the right to vote, is what we actually experienced in 1980. It is clear, it follows from our first election. And it's something that we have gone through over the last 43 years of our existence as a country. So Zimbabwe's first election in 1980 was historic and the most significant election, arguably we can say, even though many in our country today didn't quite experience it, not least because they were not born. But the most significant election we've had in our 43-year history as an independent country is the 1980 election. Why? Because it was held without a voter's roll for the indigenous population, for the black majority, who had been denied the right to vote until, as we all know, the indigenous population took up arms to win the right to vote. We can't say to regain it because, given what our history, one would be hard-pressed to find a time in history when we, as a population, as a nation, had a right to vote. Everyone had the right to vote before 1980. So it's significant that we fought for it as a nation and won it. And when we won it, it's even more significant that we enjoyed it as a nation without a voters' roll. All that the indigenous population needed to do, the blacks in 1980, who were after the Lancaster processes under the so-called common roll for the 80 seats. We will all remember that we had a parliament which had 100 seats, 80 were in the common roll for blacks, and 20 were in the so-called special roll for whites. So this point that blacks, the Africans, simply needed to prove their citizenship using their national ID card in order to vote, and were able to vote and to manage or guard against multiple voting. All they needed was the ink, is really a story that needs to be told and celebrated in ways we have not done as Zimbabweans. Because we somehow are one of these societies which does not reflect on historical experiences, an event-based society, and we miss out on certain experiences that have defined our country and from which we can learn, improve, and build on as we move forward. So one of the most significant things about us is that we went through our historic independence election. We voted, and when we speak of a country, it doesn't mean, oh, but were you there yourself? Did you vote, or did this one? No, but the history of a country is exactly that. Those who voted, they voted for everyone. Who was not there, they voted for everyone in posterity, for all generations to come. So we had a great and historic start organizing an election and running it in 1980 without a voters' roll. We started showing that an election is not a voters' roll, based on that and that experience, where we were able to give full expression to this principle of what is called universal adult suffrage, which ensures the right to vote for as many people as possible under the concept of one man, one vote, or as indicated earlier, better stated as one person, one vote. Unfortunately, when we hit 1985, after 5 years of that experience, we did not reflect on how beautiful and wonderful it was to actually have such a great start and to build on that great start. Instead, and arguably because by then in 1985, against the background of everything else that was happening, and in particular, given the then agenda for a legislated one-party state, which was in full swing, our country, Zimbabwe, copied what was happening elsewhere in the African continent, and what the independent countries had done after gaining their independence, which was to adopt a colonial electoral system, both the British colonial electoral system, based on a winner-takes-all, first past the post constituency election. So the 80 seats became 80 constituencies, the white roll 20 constituencies to make the total of 100. And the worst thing that happened with this development, which was critically fueled by the one-party state sentiments of the day, was the introduction of a constituency-based voters' roll for blacks for the first time. And this came with qualifications. You know, the thing is, you can imagine, prior to independence, you had a qualified voters' roll, and the qualifications made were such that they necessarily led to the exclusion of blacks. And you would have thought that if there was one thing we were not going to have after independence, is a voters' roll with the qualifications. You would have thought that we would have learned something in 1980, that the best and only meaningful qualification is your citizenship. But that changed in 1980 as the eye was now on the creation of a one-party state. And in 1990, the constituency-based voters' roll was perfected. As a country, we abolished the bicameral House, abolished the special white voters' roll, introduced a new unicameral House with 150 members, 120 from constituencies, and 8 governors, 10 chiefs, 12 non-constituency MPs who were appointed by the president. And under this constituency-based voters' roll, which had started in 1985, but which found greater expression now in 1990 as there was more clarity about the one-party state agenda, 3 problems arose, which have led to where we are today. These 3 problems arose out of 3 allegations about the excesses, the negative consequences of a constituency-based voters' roll. One was that there was an allegation that this type of a voters' roll, as was experienced in our country, enabled multiple voting. And this was arising out of the fact that because all of the, first, the constituency will have many polling stations, a given number of polling stations. And each one of those polling stations would have the same copy of a voters' roll. Everyone would be registered on that constituency voters' roll if they were resident in that constituency. It meant that it was possible for a voter to vote at a given polling station and then get their name cancelled to show that they've voted on the voters' roll at that particular polling station, then wash off the ink somehow. And there were many stories about how you wash off the ink from your finger to show that you had not voted when in fact you would have voted, and go to another polling station and repeat, vote again, wash off, and so forth. So it was possible, so went the allegation, to vote at many polling stations and therefore rig through that activity. There was also another allegation that it was possible, or better stated, that the constituency voters' roll allowed the creation of ghost polling stations that enabled ghost voting by ghost voters, to mean basically the constituency voters' roll enabled the stuffing of ballot papers in some ballot box where some people will sit in some tent somewhere and have that as polling station X and sit there having a nice time waiting for 7 p.m. When the polling will close, and as they begin to get an idea how voting is happening in terms of the results, they can now stuff the ballot boxes seated alone there to compensate for whatever might be happening in order to ensure victory. And that this was used to rig during those early days. The allegation was that this would be used to rig constituency elections. It has since become very difficult to rig constituency elections. There are more allegations these days, as everyone I'm sure is aware, about rigging of a national election, the presidential election in particular. But rigging of ward elections and constituency elections since the early 2000s has become a bit of a challenge. But prior to that, there were allegations that the constituency voters' role enabled rigging even at that level, because all that was needed is to create some fake polling station and literally stuff it with ballot votes. The third allegation, which was persistent and very serious, was that under the constituency-based voters' roll, the then Registrar General was actually a rigging instrument who had over the years discovered ways of manipulating the voters' roll to benefit the ruling party. And you know, he became a targeted point of contestation. So these allegations of a porous and manipulatable constituency voters' roll, which started in 1985, when ZAP was the real nationalist opposition, continued and were quite a thorny issue in the 1990 general election when Zuma was the opposition, and became particularly full-blown in the 2000 parliamentary election, 2002 presidential election, 2005 parliamentary election, and became a focus or an issue of a disputed issue between ZANU-PF and the MDC, as it was then. And in the 2007 reform talks between ZANU-PF and the MDC, under the SADC brokered Mbeki mediation, this was one of the really hot talking points, which resulted in the first major reform of the voters' roll ahead of the 2008 election. So, as a result of that engagement, one of the things that happened was to abandon or even, let us be clear, abolish, because this will help us when we conclude this discussion, the consequences of this. We abolished as a country the use of a constituency voters' roll for an election. We abolished it by law in 2008 and replaced the constituency voters' roll for elections with the ward voters' roll. But this really didn't seem to have produced any excuse me. It didn't seem to result in anything positive. We all know about what happened with the 2008 election, when we had an inconclusive election, the presidential election, and a contested presidential runoff election that never was. In the end, it didn't end up as a runoff because it was a one-candidate election. So while the 2008 election really, if we had not had that fiasco,
Prof, you've muted your mic. Please unmute your mic.
Sorry. Thank you. The 2008 election was it had been crafted in the heavens as one that should have been excellent, marked a major break with the past in terms of the reform of the voters' roll. But it was then overtaken by ugly events, which has made it to stand out in history as one of the ugliest elections. Anyway, perhaps partly because of that ugly background to the 2008 election, but also because the introduction of the word-based voters' roll did not, functionally speaking, do away with the three problems which I shared about the constituency-based voters' roll. It didn't remove the allegations of multiple voting. It didn't deal with problems of ghost polling stations that enabled ghost voting and ghost voters, meaning some men in dark glasses stuffing ballot papers. They are sitting by themselves. Those persisted. And also the Registrar General, Mr. Tobai, they remained there in charge of voters registration, and he continued to suffer allegations of stuffing the voters' roll with dead voters and so forth. So the problems persisted, but made worse by the ugly background of what happened in the 2008 election. Fortunately for us as a country, after that ugly 2008 election, and still with the benefit of the SADC mediation, which had preceded the 2008 election, but been tainted by what then transpired, we got the so-called GPA, Global Political Agreement, under which the MDC, which significantly, in its two formations, the one that was led by the late Morgan Tsvangirai on the one hand, and the other that was led by Professor Welshman Ngobe, the two of them won parliament. For the first time, the opposition in Zimbabwe defeated the ruling party, because one of the things that had happened as a result of the processes of negotiation ahead of the 2008 election was that we had a constitutional amendment that increased the number of constituencies from 120 to 210. And then reintroduced the bicameral House, an awkward Senate arrangement, which unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your political side, led to the split in the MDC. But the fact of ZANU-PF losing parliament for the first time to the opposition was a major factor that shaped subsequent reform of the voters' roll. But as you will recall, the 2008 election itself was significant for yet a third reason. Remember, the first reason is it was the first election since 1985 when we abolished the constituency voters' roll. But also, it's the election which was ugly because of the violence that we experienced related to the presidential election. But the other major thing about that election, which we should remember it for, is that it's the first time since 1985, we can say since independence, or more particularly, if we want to be exact, since the introduction of the executive presidents in 87, and then the 1990 election, when we harmonized elections. Compatriots sometimes get agitated when they hear the phrase that we have harmonized general elections, because then they follow the word harmony and say, but what do you mean harmony? What harmony is there, and so forth? When in fact, what is being described is simply that prior to 2008, we have always had these three elections, or if we talk from that time, we had always had local authority elections run separately, parliamentary elections run separately from after the 1990 election, and the presidential election run separately because the period or term for the presidents was 6 years, parliament 5 years. But there were concerns, and in fact, it is an interesting discussion why this became necessary. But the elections were held together for the first time in 2008. The presidential election, which was due in 2008, but there was widespread fear in the ruling party that if we let the president run alone, the outcome will be disastrous. So although Parliament had been elected in 2005 and the next election was due, was due in 2010, it was cut short so that we could all escort our president in the election. And that's partly why some elements in the ruling party invented the Boram Sango to say, oh, you want us to escort you? We will not escort you. You will play alone. We will play Boram Sango and so forth. But we developed this constitutional concept, which we are now living with, of a harmonized election, meaning hold the three elections together in 2008. And I don't see us moving away from that anytime soon. And it's something that is done. It's best practice. You may have different elections, but whenever you're having presidential elections and so forth, it should also be the same time you're having significant, if not altogether, parliamentary or legislative elections, as well as local authority elections. That's what they do in presidential systems like the United States and South Africa and so forth, although in South Africa, they don't elect the president directly. So we took advantage of the GNU that was produced by the GPA, Global Political Agreement that came after the ugly 2008 election, which then had agreed, part of a major plank of the GPA was COPAC to produce the new or a new constitution. So in 2013, and as a result of the COPAC process and the adoption of the new constitution, the ward-based voters' roll was abolished. It lived for one term only, unlike the constituency one. It was abandoned in favor of a polling station-based voters' roll. This stood to reason because, as I intimated earlier, the nub of the criticism, the source of the allegations of rigging was that it was happening where voters were able to vote at more than one polling station. To get rid of that mischief, that someone will go and vote at polling station A, have their name cancelled there, but because they know that polling station B also has the same voters roll, they will find some funny way using Maheo or 7 days or whatever chemical to wash the ink off, go and vote at that polling station. That's the mischief, which was a big problem with the voters' roll in Zimbabwe, which mischief has defined the evolution of the voters' roll in our country. So it was agreed that in order to deal a blow once and for all against this mischief, we come up with a polling station-based voters' roll, which meant your name will be only at one polling station. This idea that you have a voters' roll that is kept by multiple polling stations, we kissed it goodbye in 2013 and said we'll just make it such that a registered voter will be at one polling station, and when they vote, we cancel their name there, dip the finger with the ink, which was no longer really necessary because if the system worked properly, once we cancel your name at that polling station, you can't come back to the same polling station having washed off your ink and expect that you will vote because your name would have been cancelled to show that you have voted. This was a very significant development and a very important development, and one that is progressive and one that we should celebrate as a major, major achievement. And then not only then celebrate and sit back, but work on it, entrench it, perfect it, to give effect to that fundamental political right to vote. That's why the Electoral Act was amended. The Electoral Act is one of the most notorious pieces of legislation in our country, and it's really a pity that it hasn't been reviewed and aligned not only with the new constitution, the 2013 constitution, but with the changes, practical changes that have taken place to render a number of provisions which are still in the Electoral Act null and void. But significantly, you now have in section 20, subsection 4A of the Electoral Act, a clear position which is creating confusion in the minds of some compatriots today. And it is the position that ZEC, which was given the responsibility to register voters when it was taken away from the Registrar General, which was really just taking away from Tobayiwa, the individual, as you know, because and sometimes create other problems when you have successfully removed those individuals. We see that in the case of the voters' roll, targeting Tobayiwa. We see that in the Mugabe must go mantra. But the point here is that we then have in the Electoral Act a provision that says the commission may prepare and maintain in printed or electronic form a consolidated national voters roll and a consolidated constituency voters roll and a consolidated ward voters roll. But none of these will be used for purposes of polling or voting in any election. We have to point out that the reference to a national voters roll is really misleading, because in the evolution of the voters roll in Zimbabwe, we have never had a voters roll which is national and is used for voting. Never. We started with no voters roll at all, and then we developed a constituency voters roll, then a ward voters roll, and now a polling station voters roll. We have never had a national voters roll for voting purposes. But now we have a very clear law that, yes, our commission, the ZEC, or Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, it can consolidate or have a consolidated national voters roll or a constituency voters roll or a ward voters roll. But that voters roll, so consolidated, cannot be used for an election. Now, the moment you say that something cannot be used for elections, it really limits its use, because a voter's roll is important to the extent that you can use it for an election. If you cannot use it for an election, it becomes an administrative instrument or an academic instrument for statistical purposes and so forth, irrelevant for voting. This is very important to understand, because if you are going to consolidate something, you are understanding that it is not the source. You are consolidating it from a source. I have seen some discussions, compatriots saying, no, it's very important to understand that the polling station voters roll is extracted from the constituency voters roll or from the ward voters roll or from the national. No, you can't extract it. We do not have, and we cannot expect to have, rationally speaking, a voters roll that is constructed from top down. That doesn't make sense. It is irrational to imagine the creation of a voters roll that is starting from national, then it goes to constituency, then it goes to ward, and finally it reaches a polling station. It's nonsensical, frankly speaking. What you can do is you can have a voters roll consolidated, a ward voters roll consolidated, meaning sum total of polling stations that are found in a ward. You can then take those polling stations and create a ward voters roll, but you are not creating it for voting purposes. You are creating it for administrative and academic purposes. You can similarly take all polling stations which are found in all wards in a constituency to consolidate a constituency voters roll, to say, here are polling stations that are in this constituency. Again, you are not doing it for voting purposes. You are not doing it for the election, but for administrative purposes. Similarly, you then say, if we have 12,300 or 500 polling stations in the country, which fall in these wards, and these 200, well, let's name the number, in these 1,970 wards, in these 210 constituencies, if we take them all together, we consolidate them to make up a national voters roll. But it's that voters roll, the national voters roll, the constituency voters roll, and the ward voters roll, consolidated from polling stations. Those three, they are useless to the voter. And the most important person is the voter. And who is this person? In terms of Section 67 of our Constitution, it's the citizen. You know, this can be useful for political parties, useful for universities, useful for the Electoral Commission, but it's useless to the voter. The voter need not go there to research their name in the ward constituency or national voters roll. The voter goes to the polling station, and the polling station voters roll is made for the voter, for the convenience of the voter. The voter, in terms of Section 67 of the Constitution, is entitled to a free and fair election. And the evolution of the voters roll in Zimbabwe has shown that a constituency and a ward-based voters roll is detrimental to the voter, the citizen, possibility of having a free and fair election as enshrined in Section 67 of the Constitution. So that's why the attention is on the voter. What does this mean? I now going towards my conclusion. So what does this mean? What this means is that a voters roll, or the voters roll in Zimbabwe, has now been decentralized to the village in the rural areas and to the street in the urban areas, because polling stations are in the villages, they are in the street. And by law, unlike these huge constituencies, voters roll, constituency-based voters roll, which had huge numbers, and the ward also had quite some, the wards in Zimbabwe have 6,000 plus households, which are quite huge numbers if those then produce registered voters. But by law, a polling station voters roll, which is now related to village level or street level, must not have more than 1,000 registered voters. Now, that is manageable not only to the candidate. You can actually sit and overnight sift through 1,000 names and research those and analyze those. You don't need some rocket scientist to help you to analyze and research a polling station voters roll as a candidate. Better if you are a party and you have capacity. But as a voter also, you can relate to that. It is now based on your community, where you live. It is now a living voters roll. You can relate to it in practical terms, and you can use it to address local issues. It is now in sync with one of the most important political principles, that the best politics is local. You are no longer dealing with some huge, unmanageable constituency voters roll. This is very good. However, and unfortunately, while the voters roll has been decentralized to the local level, the village level, the street level, its management has not been. It is still managed by a central body up there in Harare called the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It is, and of course, this body in Harare has neither capacity nor competence to manage the voters roll. And it is admitted that it doesn't have. You should check the Hansard for the debate earlier this year, just around May, on the Electoral Amendment Act that had been meant to apply for this election. There is now a consensus, certainly in this parliament that is outgoing, but I would say in the political community, and I would say within ZEC, that ZEC is not the best body to register voters and therefore to manage a voters roll. Unfortunately, while this is useful and significant consensus, significant concessions across the political divide, the thinking is the voters roll is better managed by the Registrar General now that Tobiwa is not there. That is, first of all, primitive politics that does things targeting a person. Reforms ought to be institutional, they ought to be substantive. From a substantive point of view, it is important to take note of the fact that, as it happens whether in academia or in the real world processes, reality always lead. Ideas follow reality. Or as we say in academia, theory follows practice. It's a fact that practically the voters roll has gone ahead of everyone. It is advanced in a progressive way. It's now with the people. The people can relate what's on paper with what they see. They can relate to the people, those names, and the households and communities there, that this is us. For that reason, it is important for the management and control of the voters roll to follow the people. The best institutional management of the voters roll is the municipality, the local municipality, not ZEC, not the Registrar General, but the local authority. The voters roll in a constitutional democracy, in a progressive society, is managed and controlled at the local level. So that if someone wants to say, so-and-so is not a resident here, It should not be theoretical like this guy Loved Mangwana did in the case of Kasukwere. The guy doesn't, I think he's from somewhere in Mondoro, is not from Totito where Kasukwere is registered. He goes and complains and says, but this guy is not in the voters' roll, when they actually are not even in the same communities. And he says the fact that this guy is now a candidate while he's not on the voters' roll is infringing on my rights. Infringe on what right? You are not even part of the guy's community. How can he infringe on your right? But if you are going with the logic and principle of best politics, local politics, decentralized voters roll, polling station, then yeah, you are now in the same community. And this, by the way, is the best international practice. The voters roll in America, which a lot of people, certainly in Zimbabwe, want to use as an example of a democratic society, is controlled at the local level, at the county level. There's no federal voters roll. There's no state voters roll. There's county voters roll, and each county has its own rules about the management of that voters roll. In the UK, the Electoral Commission in the UK does not run elections. The elections are run by returning officers in local councils. That's where they are done. That's the international best practice. Now, in Zimbabwe, we don't have to do this because someone is running a political experiment. We have to do this because the principle of decentralizing functions that deal with fundamental rights of people that they enjoy in their everyday life is in our constitution. The new constitution, right from section 3, gives the authority to govern is derived from the people. Legislative authority derived from the people. Executive authority derived from the people. Judicial authority derived from the people. In fact, with reference to judicial authority, it is mind-boggling that you still go to the courts and you hear them say, the state versus so-and-so, the state versus so-and-so. Where is the state mentioned in our constitution? Does judicial authority derive from the state? No, it is derived from the people. Look at section 88, subsection 1, or rather 162. And then you wonder, why are the people not recognized? But in this case, the same section 3, which says the authority to govern is derived from the people, in section 3, subsection 2L, says the Constitution, a founding value, a major founding value and principle of the Constitution of Zimbabwe is the devolution and decentralization of governmental power and functions. Governmental power and functions. Now, the voters' roll is one such function, which is in the hands of ZEC, which has previously been in the hands of the Registrar General, which should now appropriately be in the hands of the local municipality. And once that happens, this principle of residency, for example, falls away for national office. It stays for local office. The concept that the voters' roll in constitutional democracies is decentralized means that for local government, where services are delivered, the people need to know to whom are they delivering these services. Actual services, everyday services. Residency applies. But if you take in countries where the voters' roll is managed as it should be, decentralized at the local level, the residency, in order to be able to vote, you won't find an example where you must be on the voters' roll for more than 90 days before the election. In America, it's only about 2/3 of the states in America require a residency where they would say you should be on the voters' roll or register on the voters' roll at least 30 days before the election. About 1/3 of the states in America, counties in those states, they don't require any period. You can, in fact, go and vote on voting day without having registered. In other words, you go there, register on the spot and vote. It's like arriving in a country visa-free without a visa, and they give you the visa at the airport. In Zimbabwe, a problem with the voters' roll, which political parties are feeding into the problem, is that they treat the voters' roll as some kind of holy grail. You must be there. And then if you look at section 23, subsection 3 of the Electoral Act, notorious section, which was introduced in 2004, which was used to remove Kasukwere from the nomination, it says you must be resident, not even in your constituent, in your polling station, by the polling station or the street or village where your polling station is for 18 continuous months. But in a constituency, when the constituency voters' roll has actually been abolished, and they say you must be there for 18 continuous months, for you to remain. If you are not there for 18 continuous months, you will be deemed to have been removed or deregistered by operation of law. I assure you, if you check any constitutional democracy anywhere in the world, you will not find such a draconian residential requirement. As I said, in the case of the United States, it's 30 days before voting. In many other states, it's 0 days. You can go and vote. But in many other places, as far as national elections are concerned, there is no residential requirement of any kind. Many countries, constitutional democracies, and Zimbabwe is one of them in this regard, where citizens by birth are allowed to have dual citizenship, to be citizenship of another country. It is preposterous to imagine that you say, okay, you are a citizen of Zimbabwe and a citizen of country B, but you will not vote unless you stay for, not vote in a national election, unless you stay in some constituency as a resident for 18 continuous months. It then takes away not only the rights, the right to vote, that is in section 67, but it also makes a mockery of your citizen. Why are you a citizen if you can't choose or participate in an election of a national or office holder? If you check what Justice Mangota said in the Kasukwere case, he said the legislature, although they didn't state, or it is not at least indicated in the act, why they came up with a requirement of residency for 18 continuous months in a constituency. In his view, it was because you stay there, read the newspapers there, hear stories of that constituency, and become familiar with local issues, and you know what's happening, and then you can vote. That logic is okay, as long as we are talking about a local authority election. It is not okay when you're talking about a national election for a member of parliament who goes to Harare, leaves the local place, goes to Harare to debate laws there, or a president who governs from Harare and is voted by each and every polling station across the country. That kind of an office, one ought to be able to vote or participate wherever they are. Even if they are in some dungeon, they ought to be able to vote for a president as long as they can prove their citizenship. And this is the global international best practice. Therefore, I think that we should be thankful as Zimbabweans that we have, through experience, ended up by default, if you want, decentralizing the voters' roll. Unfortunately, its management has not followed the voters' roll, has not gone to where the voters' roll is. The voters' roll is in Makayas, decentralized in the villages and streets in urban areas where the polling stations are. But the managers of the voters' roll are in Harare. That's wrong. That's a misfit, and it needs to be fixed. The political parties are not helping the fixing because they want to get a national voters' roll, which is not used for elections, which is not where the people are, which doesn't assist the candidates where they are contesting in the polling stations or at the polling stations or by the polling stations, doesn't assist the voters who are there. It's useful for academic debates, political debates. Why is this name appearing twice, 3 times there in the national voter? But go and see whether names are appearing twice, 3 times and so forth in the polling station. And you know what? Lastly, in the United Kingdom, for example, if you are not a registered political party, you are not a candidate or a consumer-based organization that is registered licensed, you cannot access the voters' roll. This idea that anyone can come and pay X amount and get either an electronic copy or physical copy of a voters' roll, like they are buying some milk or whatever item off the shelf, is unacceptable and is not best practice. Only happens in countries that don't understand the link between the voters' roll and the voter, and the fact that there is private information there which should be accessible to appropriate people who can be held accountable if they abuse that information. The people who are supposed to access the voters' roll are the candidates, because they must be voters, they must be registered voters, the voter, and the registered political parties, not some political party which is not registered, or some organization which is shadowy somewhere, which comes and so forth. There's some logic to this, and the logic is that the most important political right that a person can have, political right, is the right to vote. That right needs to be protected. That right needs to be linked to that person's existential reality, living conditions, and there's no better way of achieving that than under a decentralized voters' roll, localized voters' roll, managed locally by the local municipality, and analyzable and researchable by the candidate at the local level and the voter at the local level. So we should be grateful that for the reasons I shared, our country actually has a progressive voters roll, but we should now work to make the management of that voters roll match its reality. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Professor Moyo. You know, how the voters' roll has evolved, the factors that have affected that evolvement, and also for sharing your thoughts on what could be more effective when it comes to the voters' roll and an election.
If you just join us, guys, this morning, I'm talking to Professor Moyo. The topic for this morning is the Zimbabwean voters' roll, its evolution in the context of comparative best practices. Just unpack a lot of things there. We spoke highly about the voters' roll, the importance of the voters' roll, and also what needs to be done going forward. I see many speakers just joining us today. They want to contribute, want to ask questions, and I see the comments are coming. Again, for us, guys, let's try to be brief and giving you comments or giving you questions this morning. Let's go to Post. Good morning this morning. How are you this morning?
Oh, I'm very well. Thank you so much, Brighton and on Frontline. Thank you so much for bringing Professor out there. Professor, it's always a pleasure to engage with you on these Twitter tweets, or should we call them X tweets now? It's such a pleasure. But I feel sometimes people kind of get lost when you give background. I listen to the background that you give, the history of what's going on, and I really appreciate it because it makes me more aware. So I want to appreciate you for that. But I felt the need to come and ask you a few questions so that we can gain clarity on the matters that you were discussing. Now, Professor, I may obviously be citing this wrong, but I heard you say something to do with an election cannot be the voters' roll. This is the statement I heard come from you. And you said rather the voters' roll is an administrative instrument for the right to vote. And I kind of feel like the two things are the same then, because we can't say that an election is not the voters' roll, because that is one of the components that assists this whole process of our elections to be more transparent and accountable. And having said that, my question would therefore be, when it comes, obviously, on the basis of the failure of ZEC to release the voters' roll to the political parties and be transparent to its stakeholders. Remember, the elections are just a few days away now. Can we then say, is ZEC an institution that is continually used to steal the citizens' vote in favor of the ruling party? I feel I would love to hear more of what you have to say with regards to that. And I also listened as you were talking about the issue of Xavier Kasukwe and how this whole issue of being a citizen has been questioned. Not just being a citizen, basically him being removed from the voters' roll on the basis of him being outside of the country. Now, you and I are outside of the country. And really, that law, it appears to me as it disadvantages and all the Zimbabweans that are outside the diaspora. Do you agree with the judgment when it comes to the manner in which the issue of Xavier Kasukwe has been dealt with? I'd love to hear more of what you think about that. And also, could you just clarify there, because I feel this is where you can help us all. Do you believe that it is right for ZEC not to release the voters' roll? I mean, we are just a few days now away from the elections. Is it correct for them to do so? And if your answer is no, what then can be done to assist us in this? I heard you mention that it would be good if there was a sort of another, ZEC was not the body that was dealing with the voters' roll. But unfortunately, this is the situation we have. So I would hope that you would respond to the fact that, what do we do about ZEC? What do we do about SADC being quiet about these things? The voters' roll surely should be important in an election, which is so important to all citizens. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bosalan, for that question. Yeah, I see another question there coming through from the comments. I think similar to this. Someone says, I'm so confused by Professor Jonas Moyo's submission that an election is not a voter's roll. My question is, how can one cast their vote if their name is not appearing in the voter's roll? In other words, that also means the Bereka Mwana strategy, which was used by CCC, was the best. Professor, what's your response to those two questions posed by the listeners this morning?
Thank you, Brighton. And thank you for your comments and questions, Salani. And I take from Brighton's summary that the main issue is on the observation that an election is not a voter's roll. The tragedy of the speaker is that sometimes you say things and you think this is really, really my main point and people have understood. And then you get a rude awakening when they start speaking, they indicate in vivid terms that you haven't made your point as we thought you made it. Let me repeat on this point, and I will try and deal with Salani's other questions if I understood them well. But on this point, I said I'm one of those people. In fact, I really would like to claim that in the context of the Zimbabwean discourse, I'm the one who started the narrative that an election is the voter's roll. I'm very aware of that. And it was, as is always the case, if you are dealing with questions of public policy, public life, dealing with the issues that were coming up and issues that we've experienced. But the good thing with the research is that it's not a religion. Social science, political science, and the politics itself is not a religion. You don't hold to something because you said it yesterday. You hold on to it because it is supportable. It is speaking to the condition, the human condition, as it is evolving. So I then explained to you, colleagues, that whereas I have been of the persuasion that an election is a voter's roll, when Zenzele Ndebele asked me yesterday to address this topic because of a post that I put, and I assume this, he didn't tell me this, and then I realized that the question he framed, which I had not put in my post, was that it would be useful from side's point of view, if I explained this question in the context of the evolution of the voters' roll in Zimbabwe, given global practice best standard. So I said, when I now sat down yesterday to review this question, I realized something that I otherwise knew, something that every other Zimbabwean, and certainly of my age, knows, that the first election, the independence election in Zimbabwe, for Zimbabweans who had to fight for the right to vote in an election to choose those who govern them, that election was held without a voters' roll. There was no voters' roll for blacks in 1980. You didn't have to be registered on a voters' roll, and then you go to a polling station, they look for your name, they find it, they cancel it, they give you the ballot papers, you vote, you come out, you dip your finger there to get. That is not what happened. And I'm saying to Salani and this other colleague, you didn't say, Brighton, please think about that. That's not theory. That's reality. Zimbabweans have voted without a voters' roll and voted very well and produced a government. And some Zimbabweans say that that government did wonderful things in education, in health, blah, 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 blah. That government they voted for without a voters' roll. And I'm saying to you, you can't come from a country where you have voted and produced a government without voters' roll and not sit back and reflect on that experience and compare it with the experience where you voted with the voters' roll and ask yourself, which was the better of the two experiences, one without a voters' roll and the other with a voters' roll? And ask yourself, why did the authorities decide to have a voters' roll in 1985 and a kind of a voters' roll that has evolved over the years as a constituency-based voters' roll with the problems that, at least some of the problems that I outlined? So you can't come back to me and make me appear like I'm discussing something strange or of my own making. I am compelled by the historical fact to sit back and question my 3-year-old proposition that an election is a voters' roll versus the historical experience that one of the best elections that people remembered, enjoyed, and so forth. Yes, there were problems here and there, but by and large, all told, it's an experience that many have lived to tell wonderfully. And I think because of the problems we're having with the voters' roll today, we may get a lot of wisdom by reflecting on that experience. One of the things about that election is it was a proportional representation. It was not a constituency-based election. And the kind of proportional representation we have now is not the same as the one we had in 1980. And there's something wrong, perhaps, but certainly something to think about regarding the first past the post. And the fact that we have the PR applied to women's quota, youth quota, and to Senate is problematic, the way we are using it. And we know that those members of parliament who are elected on a PR system based on the election of a first past the post for the National Assembly, they don't feel okay. And you invoked the Berekamwana kind of thing. The kind of proportional representation we have is a Berekamwana kind of thing. It's not an election. Let me put it this way. It's certainly not similar to the 1980 where people were voting for this party and that party, or the kind of proportional representation they have in South Africa, which is a party-based system. So you know the strength of political party and so forth. So frankly, I think that the proposition that an election is a voters' roll, as a proposition, analytically speaking, is an exaggeration. There's no way anyone can sustain it as an absolute truth. That's why I did not dismiss the voters' roll, but I can't really seriously sit here hit with or reminded of the 1980 experience that we had an election without a voters' roll, and it was very good. I can't sit here and say yes, an election is a voters' roll, and to justify the treatment of the voters' roll we have had, which is not in line with global best practice. I just said in passing that in some countries, you don't have to be registered before the election in order to vote on election day. You can go on election day and prove that you have been resident there for some 30 days and you are a citizen and you will vote. Now, if that is possible, what is it that makes the voters' roll such a sacrosanct thing that is being made in Zimbabwe? Nothing. It is a useful administrative mechanism, tool. It's an administration tool for the convenience of voting. It can't be and shouldn't be a tool for limiting people's fundamental rights that people are born with. It is outrageous, in my view, to use a voter's roll to limit someone's citizenship. That is not different from what the colonialists used to do. They used the voters' roll as an instrument of making people who do not, for example, own property, feel like lesser beings who must not participate in the choice of those who should govern. That is ridiculous. People, in our case, fought a liberation struggle. If we were to be true to that struggle and be guided by the values and principles that are in Section 3, which includes recognition of that struggle, do you really think they fought for that struggle for people to be constrained, limited in the exercise of one man, one vote? You know, their battle cry was one man, one vote, by which they meant one person, one vote. It was also something they called NIBMA, no independence before majority rule, which majority rule was only attainable by the exercise of the right to vote. Now, if you are going to start playing games with the right to vote, the guy is not a prisoner, the guy is not certified by medical people to be mentally, to have a mental situation of one sort or another, is just a citizen. And then you start coming up with the same colonial qualifications to be on a voter's roll. And then after you do that, you want people to say, but an election is a voter's roll. No, no. An election is a political right. Our constitution does not say an election is a voter's roll. We said it in debating and discussing with each other. But the constitution is so clear that an election is not a voter's roll. An election is the right to vote. And the right to vote is a fundamental political right that is enshrined in Section 67. That's what I meant. And I hope this time I've clarified myself, and I want to repeat the real critical clarification. It is that Zimbabweans held an election in 1980 without a voter's roll. Let's go back there and start again. But the fact is, where we are, we have made progress, having had a good start, then spoil it in 1985, 1990, 1996, 2000, 2002, 2005, 2008. Finally, we got it right in 2013. And I think for a country to move forward, it is important to acknowledge and celebrate milestones and then work on them. The milestone of a polling station voters' roll is really, truly significant. It makes us a far better country than many of our neighbors. But for that to be perennially or permanently true, we then need to do the other part, which is really how do we think we can manage a local a reality, the decentralized voters' roll from Harare? And I think it doesn't make sense. And devolution is already in our constitution. One of the functions of government that must be devolved to municipalities, local authorities, that is the voters' roll. Now, do I think ZEC should release the voters' roll? Of course. But I don't think ZEC should release a voters' roll now, today, 7 days before voting, release a voters' roll which is useful for academic purposes. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's a distraction. I think it's a desktop thing which might be useful for some people in Harare, but it can be useful for people in Cholocho, Mzarabani, Wende Valley, who are going to vote at some polling station there, who know they are on a polling station voters' roll, a voters' roll which is easy to print there at the district or ward or province and distribute and make sure that the candidates have and that the voters can access at the local office there. And, you know, political parties should help candidates and voters. Political parties shouldn't replace. In Zimbabwe, we still have a problem that these political parties are actually not registered and they don't behave according to the dictates of the constitution. And I take the view that the voters' roll should be released to the candidates. The voters' roll should be released to the voter, or at least the voters should have access to the voters' roll. And the one that is manageable with no more than 1,000 registered voters is the polling station voters. But yes, ZEC should release that one. You know, I know about voter rigging, election rigging, and so forth. Fortunately, that's not the discussion today. The discussion today, and sometimes we have to have this discipline. The discussion is the evolution of the voters' roll in the context of international best practice applied to what's going on today. And my humble suggestion, or what I'm sharing with you, is that actually our voters' roll has evolved in an interesting way. We have only had a constituency and a ward voters' roll before this polling station voters' roll, but we have never had a national voters' roll. We have never voted on the basis of a national voters' roll. And I think when people clamor for something we have never used, something we are not using, something which they should work extra if they want, but they do so from bottoms up. Because if you are a political party and you have put 1,970 candidates for the local authority election, they should get the polling station voters rolls for their ward. If you have put 210 candidates for the parliamentary election, they should get the polling station voters roll for those constituencies. They should. And if you are functioning properly, you can actually better hold accountable the electoral body, because you will be using bottom-up information. We have said, remember, a polling station, because that's the only place where a voter now votes, that's the place that generates the most important election return, called a V11. We can be practical about this. You should have your 1,000. Most polling station voters rolls have 700 people, 700 registered voters. And it's easier possible to match the V11 with those people. And where the numbers are increased in fun ways, you can be actually practical. You can not only research and analyze your voters roll, but you can relate it to voter behavior and voter results. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Prof, for responding to those questions. I'll give a chance to two others speakers to ask questions. Please, guys, let's be direct. I now have to leave the studio. So please, let's ask just one question for the professor. Good morning, Liam. What's your question to the professor?
Thank you very much. Well, I think here, one concession to make before I get into my issue is, yes, it's true that the conversation is about the voters' role and its evolution. But also, one thing we should also understand is the push factor or the initiation factor behind its evolution, especially when we bring in the conversation of a context of comparative practices and trying to decipher the best practice. And one of the central things that comes into conversation was the issue of electoral integrity in terms of having real people vote, having credibility of the process. Because in the context of 1980, there are still conversations around that say, no, that the results were contestable because no one was really sure of how many votes someone got, or everything, or even who voted, who was eligible to vote. So the evolution of the voters roll on that basis is a matter of credibility and trying to ensure also that there is integrity in terms of it. It's a mechanism to try and enforce integrity. As to whether it is to be national or not, I still take the conversation that I think a polling station based voters roll is important. Then the conversation also comes where people went for inspection of the voters roll, and those that found their names not in the voters roll but still were registered had to cite those queries in the voters roll to be corrected or rectified, even if, despite how unfair the practice was of having Sevia Kasupere put out of the ballot on the basis that he was no longer ordinarily fitting that vote. So at the end of the day, most probably his name also was removed from the voters roll. And that which now the public demands is a voters roll, even if it's polling station based, that is updated. I think that is where the conversation should go. Not necessarily saying it's also the case of the opposition, but I'm saying that is where the conversation should go, that an updated voters roll, right? And so that is where the question comes that, okay, then Prof, in the best interest of promoting electoral integrity and in the best interest of credibility of our election and admitting that the voters roll is now a paradigm within our elections that we have to accept, don't you think it's necessary now to have an updated voters roll? Despite its evolutions, yes, but still its evolution also comes with the demand for integrity and for accuracy. So don't you think that an updated voters roll, especially after citizens went to inspect it, right, and gave room for what needs to be corrected, don't you think it's now important for the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to actually give out that corrected version of the voters roll? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Liam, for that. I think, Prof, you can go ahead and respond to Liam before we take our last question.
Yes, thank you, Liam. I fully agree with him. I thought I was making the same point. Clearly, in terms of Section 67, subsection 1A of the Constitution, which says every Zimbabwean has a right to free and fair election. Free and fair, that's a right. That's the starting point before we even talk about the right to vote and the right to be voted. The first political right that every Zimbabwean citizen has in terms of the Constitution is the right to a free and fair election. You can't have a free and fair election if the voters' roll is not, to use Liam's language, updated, but in fact, if it's not accurate. The electoral body, ZEC, in terms of Section 239A, I think is what 4, subsection 239A4. ZEC is required to conduct elections efficiently, transparently, freely, fairly, for the election to be credible, as you said, Liam, and for the integrity of the elections. ZEC, therefore, as far as the polling station voters' roll is concerned, gives a preliminary voters' roll to candidates who are nominated soon after their nomination. In this case, one would have expected, and ZEC would have been required to give nominated candidates by the time they gazetted the nominated candidates on the 30th of June. And then, when they have on the basis of, because the voter registration continues in this edition of the election, the electoral or the election commission, the proclamation of the election was on the 30th of May, and voter registration ends 2 days later by law. And therefore, after the nomination process, you expect that if they have not come up with a final voters roll that will actually be used for the election, that they avail that voters roll after they have, on the basis of the last day, that is 2 days after the proclamation of the election, they then come up with a final voters roll, which really translates to final polling stations, since we have a polling station-based voters roll. And they advised that they would do so, they would have that final list by the 2nd of August. Therefore, there can't be any discussion or doubt that ZEC must provide an up-to-date, accurate voters roll as will be used on polling day. But if then you start demanding from them a consolidated voters roll, you're actually pulling them away from what they should be doing, because what they should be doing is produce a voters roll that is accurate for the integrity and credibility of the election as will be used on the day. And we would expect, because by then, when this happens, even election observers, local and international, are in the country, we will expect that then on election day, we will see whether the voters roll that they gave candidates contesting the elections is the same as the one that is being used for the elections. And that establishes the credibility and integrity of the election. So I agree. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Jonathan Moyo, for joining us today and explaining to us about the evolution of the voters' roll, all those factors that have affected it. I know, guys, I said I'll take another question, but as I said, I have to leave the studio for others as well to come in and do other programs. But please, if you know someone in Geta constituency, or if you are from Geta constituency, don't miss the Meet Your Candidate series. We are having a debate series of the MP aspiring candidates. So please make your way there and get to know your candidates. Otherwise, thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion we had today. Thank you once again, Professor Jonathan Moyo, for joining us today and sharing your experience and knowledge of what has been happening when it comes to the voters' roll. Otherwise, from myself, Prof, you wanted to say something? Okay. Otherwise, from myself, Nonhlanhla Mapigwa and Brighton Ngube, who has just left, as well as Zenzele Ndebele here, it's bye for now.